our series, we're very pleased to have with us Ranger and Chief Interpreter Hannah Marley, who is here with us today. She asked if she should wear her hat to make it official.
There you go.
I wanted to grow up to get one of those hats. That was always, anyway, fun. So we're really glad to have Hannah with us today, who's been at the site for a year now. And we've had the opportunity, my wife Carol and I have had the opportunity to be on a tour with her. Outstanding speaker, knowledgeable, informative. She went to Chapel Hill. Is that okay? I don't know, we'll get past that. Oh, there's applause. And is originally from Southport, North Carolina. And so we're very glad to have her here in South Carolina now as a member of the staff at the site. I'm looking forward. Join me in welcoming Hannah Marley.
This is very nice. This is a much bigger crowd than I usually have at Hampton. Perfect. All right, so like he was saying, I'm at Hampton for just over a year now. And I'm the Interpretive Ranger, which really just means that I do a lot of research, I do tours, and then I put together some of the events that we have coming up, and I can talk a little bit about those at the end. But what I wanted to do today was give you an overview of Hampton, and I know some of you have been out there before, so you can help me with that part. Or if you haven't been out, just the basics. And there's a lot of history at Hampton. We interpret 5 generations worth of the family that lived in the house. So that covers a lot of years, and I had a little bit of trouble condensing it down. So I'm maybe going to skim over some things, and I will have some time at the end. I won't be talking for a full hour. If we have anything that you want to hear more about, definitely feel free to ask me. And we do have more talks in the series that'll get more in depth into some of the people who are, I'm just going to mention, who are out there. Right, so, get started. So first of all, before I go into the specifics of Hampton, I did want to do more of an overview of rice and indigo in the Lowcountry because it was a plantation. These were the 2 cash crops. And just to put it into context what was going on at the plantation, we'll talk about the rice and indigo. And I know Georgetown has a great rice museum, so if you've been out there, you may have seen some of these numbers before. And you haven't seen it growing before because we mostly don't grow these in South Carolina at the moment. I have some indigo. Got a laser pointer, yes. Some indigo at the top there. That is what's being grown out at the Charles Pinckney National Historic Site in Mount Pleasant right now, so you can go out and see theirs. And then some rice down here. Even though it was a major cash crop for South Carolina, there's only 2 places that grow it now. And for a long time, up until the 90s, so from about the 1930s through the 90s, for 60 years, South Carolina did not grow rice. And I can get into the reasons for that, but it's recently revived. This is the heirloom variety Carolina Gold, so what they were actually growing on these plantations. You can still get this now from those 2 places that grow it. If you're at a good restaurant in South Carolina, they will have Carolina Gold rice because it's local, and it's very good. A little bit more expensive than what you typically get at the grocery store, but delicious. And this right in the middle, that's some of the rice close up. And there's a lot of people now, especially in my generation, who we don't really think about what our food is, where it's coming from. So a lot of people who come through on the site tour, they don't realize that the rice grains, they have husks around them. So not only is the rice being grown, but it does have to be processed, and I'll get a little bit more into that. But just so you can see, husks. Every single grain of rice, that has to be taken off. This whole thing is not numbers, but I did want to give some numbers because I think that's really the best way to show how big these crops were in South Carolina. So first of all, South Carolina is a major rice grower for 220 years. So from the 1600s all the way up through 1880. So even post-Civil War, for a little while, it was a major cash crop. And for 150 out of those 220 years, Hampton specifically was growing rice. So 1760s, that's the first time that we have records of rice being grown at Hampton. It may have been there earlier than that. And we do know it was still being grown by tenant farmers up through 1915. After that, it's not a cash crop there, not anymore. But for the entire state, we have somewhere between 80 and 120,000 acres that are being grown with rice specifically, which is a lot of acres. I usually tell field trips that come through, an acre is something like a football field, so they can't even picture 120,000 football fields worth of rice. So with all of those acres, just by 1800, the state has exported over 65 million pounds of rice, which is a lot. That's something like 16,000 cars worth of weight in rice. And for that, we made $179 million. So that's a lot of rice, that's a lot of money. It makes South Carolina the wealthiest state in the country and the wealthiest colony before we left Britain. So this area around all of these rivers that we have in the Lowcountry, specifically near the two Santee rivers, was called the heart of the Rice Kingdom. So not only was South Carolina the wealthiest state in America, but this area specifically was the wealthiest part of the state. A lot of rice. And I have a picture down there of a rice barrel. It's not the best picture. It looks a lot bigger in person. There's some foreshortening going on in here. But those barrels are very large, and they hold just under 600 pounds of rice each. So it's not a barrel that someone is picking up and hefting over their shoulder. It's being rolled around. But we have on the other side a scan of a document, and that is from the first owner of the plantation, Daniel Orry Jr.'s account books. And he's talking about how much rice each of his plantations is producing. He measured it in barrels, so you can see 103 barrels with just under 600 pounds in each barrel. That's a lot of rice just being produced on his plantations. Around this area, the average is 360,000 pounds per plantation, which is a lot, and that's right before the Civil War. And at Hampton specifically, we do have more exact records. 1869, so after the war, still producing 130,000 pounds in 1 year. So this is a lot of rice. But it is not the only cash crop, so there's also indigo, which we don't talk about as much, partially because it dies out a little bit faster. And 1740s is when indigo really becomes a cash crop for South Carolina, when it gets really big. Part of that is because of Eliza Lucas Pinckney down here. That is an artist rendering because we don't have any known pictures of her. But Eliza Lucas Pinckney, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, who as a child, a teenager, but a child, 16 years old, was running her father's plantations, got a lot of experience doing that, and was really interested in botany. So she did some experiments trying to grow indigo in South Carolina. The state had tried to grow indigo before, or the colony at that point, had tried to grow indigo before. It wasn't really profitable until Eliza Lucas Pinckney and some other planters, Andrew DeVoe, started experimenting with it, came up with a very profitable way to grow it in South Carolina. There is also a very good historical fiction book about Eliza Lucas Pinckney called The Indigo Girl, which I highly recommend because it's very well researched and it has a lot of her letters sourced throughout the entire thing, and also very readable. It's really, really good. But Eliza Lucas Pinckney also does have a family connection that I'll get into. But after she experiments with it, 1740s, South Carolina starts growing it large scale. So 138,000 pounds. For 16,000 pounds of profit. And this is in pounds at this point because we're still a colony, we're still using British pounds. And Britain was actually paying for the indigo. They put a bounty on it, which sounds like a pirate thing, but really they just subsidized it. So they were paying specifically for South Carolina to ship all the indigo that they're producing to Britain, and you get the blue dye from indigo, and they start using that for their uniforms, specifically their Navy uniforms, so navy blue, and that's still a color of authority for a lot of places. So police uniforms, that's coming out of these military uniforms, coming from indigo. So it has a big impact. Peak indigo is 1775, right before the Revolution, so over 1 million pounds of indigo grown for 242,000 British pounds. After that, we break away from Britain. There's a whole revolution, you may have heard of that. Britain stops paying for the indigo. A little bit mad at us. So for 53 years, South Carolina grew indigo, but by 1800, it's pretty much dead as a cash crop. I think the very last time it's listed as an export from South Carolina is 1802. So past that, we don't grow indigo, and then we don't talk about it as much as the rice. Over on the side, the photograph is from one of our indigo demonstrations. So this is a free event that we do. We have one coming up this Saturday. There's a flyer for it on the table. But we actually show how we go from the indigo powdered dye to dyed clothing. And it's really interesting to look at. I don't know if you can see it very well in this picture, but when the indigo is in the vat, it has a very pretty, almost iridescent blue flower on top. So it's very pretty, and it does produce a very pretty blue color on clothing. But for both of these, for rice and indigo, there's a large amount of labor required. So we'll also talk a little bit about slavery in the area. Very top number, I have 90,000 African slaves who are coming through South Carolina. So South Carolina ports, 40% through Charleston, just by the start of the Revolution, 90,000 people. By 1808, it was technically illegal to bring anybody else from Africa into the country. And so by the time we hit 1808, that cutoff date, this number is something like 100,000 people. And that's just coming through the ports. There's a large number of people who are required for all of this work. This chart, this is numbers pulled from census data. So depending on where we are with rice production, the numbers fluctuate, but they're mostly going up and up. So 1790, the earliest that we have, 43% of the entire population of South Carolina are people who are enslaved. So that's a large number, but by the time we hit 1860, right before the Civil War, it's over half the population, 57%. And one of the differences here, so I've broken it down into Charleston County and Georgetown County, or districts as they may have been called at that point. 53% near Charleston right before the war, which is a large number, still over half. Georgetown County, it's up at 85%, and a large part of that is because this is where the plantations were. With all of the rivers, this is where the rice was being grown, so all of that labor, all of those people are out here rather than closer to Charleston, where there are a lot of rich families, but not as many plantations. I have some more numbers, but 50% of all of the rice in the U.S. was coming from Georgetown by 1840. And that's the entire eastern seaboard, South Carolina, just this specific area of South Carolina, 50% of the entire rice crop, which is up in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so there are 320 plantations owned by 250 families. And that's one of the things that I can show you that we have a map of, where some of these families, they own multiple plantations, but they're growing all of the rice crop in the Lowcountry by the 1850s, and that's what really makes this area very, very wealthy. And then specifically for that last number in 1860, the 85%, so there are 21,000 people listed on the 1860 census in Georgetown County. 18,000 of them are enslaved on a plantation. So it is a lot of people. There are a lot of families in South Carolina who they own slaves, but they didn't necessarily own a large number. But there were still 35 families who were enslaving over 500 people, which is a lot of people. And out of those 35 families, 21 of them are growing rice. So rice in particular is very, very labor intensive. And so there's also two people that you may have heard of, Joshua John Wood, the other name that I don't want to mispronounce, but Georgetown County residents enslaving over 1,000 people, which is some of the largest numbers in the United States. So Joshua John Ward in particular was sometimes called the king of the planters. So this is really just to drive home how much was required to grow all of this rice and indigo. And part of that is on this chart, which this is a scan from Harper's Weekly, 1867, a little bit of the rice production process. So in the middle picture of rice fields, but we have up on this side one of the rice trunks. I think they call it the floodgate, but the rice trunks are put into those fields to control the flow of water. You've probably seen, or maybe in a movie, you've seen a rice paddy where rice is grown in water. So in order to keep those fields flooded, they're using rice trunks or floodgates. There's someone threshing or reaping the rice. You can see Down here, just the rice fields, there are some birds in there. A large part of keeping the rice flooded is because birds will eat that like crazy. So there would be people who were in charge of chasing those birds away when the water wasn't keeping out. Close-up of the birds. There's another view of the rice trunk over here. Ditching, which is, in order to create those fields, that's a lot of digging to make out the grid work. And I can show you that in a little bit, but this is all in fluff mud. So that's a lot of work digging out these fields, building up the dikes and the hills that are needed to keep the water in one particular area, and then a threshing mill. So depending on the plantation, some plantations they process their rice on site, other places would ship them out to mills, and there were a lot of processing mills in the Georgetown area. But I want to focus on this part in particular, the rice trunk, because we just put one in. So there had not been a rice trunk at Hampton for 60 years, and last November we put one back in. If anyone has been here since last November, you might have seen this. But this is just so we can show people how it works. So you've got the full front view right there. This looks almost exactly the same. This design hasn't changed since the 1800s because it is very, very effective. These are my photographs from our rice trunk. So here is the dike you can walk right across. This side is where the creek is coming in, and this side is what used to be our rice field. So by opening or closing these gates, we can flood the fields with water from the creek when the tide comes in, and we mostly don't do that because of the mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs in here. But we can also open the gates when the tide goes out and the water will drain back out from the field. It's the same way that they would have done it. This is actually a technology that comes from the west coast of Africa. Rice was native there, so there are people who are living there who already knew how to grow rice. And when they're brought to these plantations and forced to work there, they already have this knowledge. So it's called a rice trunk because originally it was a tree trunk. In Africa, it would have been a mangrove tree hollowed out. Here, they were mostly using cypress. It develops into this 1800s version, haven't changed it since then. So we have one, and there are still places, if you're just driving around or going to other historic sites, you'll see these. Some of them are old ones, but some of them are still being used. The Santee Coastal Reserve, right across Highway 17 from Hampton, uses a whole bunch of these to create water impoundments, and that attracts ducks. So if you've ever been out there, it's the most ducks I've ever seen in my life. But very, very useful for wetland conservation, for habitat conservation. And it's really cool to come see if you haven't been out to Hampton. And then there's the processing part of the rice process. So this photo is from the 1940s. There were still people growing rice at Hampton up until the 1960s, although not as a cash crop. After the 19-teens, it was really just for food. But they are pounding the rice in a mortar. So that is going to start to get that husk off of it. It's kind of a delicate process. It has to be hit hard enough to crack open the husk, but not hard enough to break the grain, because those smaller pieces would have been less valuable. Once the husk is starting to come off, it's winnowed, and of course in this area you'll see a ton of the sweetgrass baskets, but the large shallow ones in particular are for winnowing rice or other grains. Once the husk is cracked open, it can be swirled around and tossed up in the air, and the husk will float away with the wind. It separates out in that basket, so then you have just the rice grain. So that was something that could be done on the plantation. Later on, they are sent to mills where it's a lot faster. All right, so we'll get more into the overview of Hampton specifically. Two pictures of the house. One where you can see the Washington oak out front a little bit better. I kind of cheated with this one because this is also a modern picture of the house. I took this and I just slapped a filter on it so it looks older. So two very pretty pictures. I do have, this one's from the 1930s. There is a great collection of pictures of Hampton with the Georgetown digital collection. So if you want to see more of these pictures, you can pull it up right online. It's amazing. Just found out about this. It's very exciting. So this is one of the older pictures. And one of the things about the house is that we don't know exactly what year it was built. There's a part in the middle, which is the oldest part of the house, built sometime between the 1730s, 1760s. There are two wings added on on this side and then another on the other side that were added sometime between the 1760s and 80s, but again, we don't have an exact date. And then a front portico, which was added in the 1790s. So, don't have a specific date that I can give you for when the house is built, but the whole thing is done by 1791. We also have our oldest documentation of the size of the plantation, a map from 1809. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is the best version that we have. But this up on this corner is an island, and this is the grid marks for where the rice fields were. So the majority of the rice fields at Hampton were across from the house, across a creek on an island. This over here is the South Santee River. Wambach Creek splits off and goes around the island and joins back in. And right across the creek, this is where all the buildings were, so our house is right in here. But it did include a lot of land over here, which was a lot of forest and some more rice fields, where it connects into the creek and the river. I put in a sketch which goes over some part of that. So this is a much clearer view. You can see the island where the rice fields were, so our grid mark here, the river up on this side, the creek coming around, and our cluster of buildings in here. This one in particular is the house. So this island is something like 450 acres worth of rice fields. So it is very large where most of the fields were, but where we kind of connect with the creek, there were some areas where rice fields were over on this side. And I also mentioned that a lot of these families owned multiple plantations. So the Orry Pinckney Rutledges that we talked about at Hampton had 12 different properties that we know of in this area around the Santee. So Hampton is right in here, and this was really their seat in the countryside. They had a house in Charleston where they stayed sometimes, but if they were out in the McClellanville Santee area, they would have been at Hampton. And not all of these plantations had houses. Some of them are just large tracts of land. So Hampton was really the center of their properties. Here's the Santee, where it splits in two, and a lot of what they have is right here around the South Santee. And I put in some satellite views as well. I just pulled this from Google Maps last week. So here's Georgetown up here. You can come straight down Highway 17. We're a little bit off the highway, but we are right in there, and you can kind of see where the North Santee is and where the South Santee is. So not that far away from Georgetown, but if you don't have a car, it's more of a distance. And then a little bit more zoomed in, again from Google, there's the river, and this one you can see the creek coming around. So on this island, you can still kind of see where those rice fields were, that grid mark, even though no one's grown rice over there for about 100 years. So that's a pretty big impact on the land. And then this one is the size of the park today. And so the park that the South Carolina State Parks has is just under 300 acres. And again, go right up to the creek. So this is the island on the other side. I think you can see a little bit of the house in there too. So that's just the overview geographically, but I do want to talk about people who live there. So of course I'm going to talk about Lake Hampton, but I'm not. No relation. That's a question that we get a lot. It's Hampton because of the Wade Hamptons, right? But it's not. No relation to the famous general. It's actually, we think, named after Hampton on the Thames, which is this house. And this is a photo, or a picture, of that house that belonged to David Garrick, who was a Shakespearean actor in England. He owned this very fancy house, and one of the first owners of the house grew up part of the time in England, Harriet Pinckney, and while she lived in England, we know that she was at this house at least some of the time, and she also had a lot of design input when they built Hampton over here. So possibly, best guess, the name comes from her naming it after this house. The portico.
What was her name again?
Harriet Pinckney. When she marries into the family, it's Harriet Pinckney Orry.
Thank you.
Got pictures, yes. So our first documented owner of the house is Daniel Orry Jr. Daniel U.G. Orry Jr. The U.G. part always throws me off. I was not aware it was a French name. I was in Columbia visiting family, and I thought they were saying Eugene. And then we turned onto UG Street, and oh, this is huger, but it is. So this area specifically had a lot of these French Huguenot families who settled to the point where it was called the French Santee. So I had to brush up a little bit on French pronunciation. So Daniel Eugene Horry Jr. And we're pretty sure he did not build the house. It was most likely his dad or even someone who owned the land before the Ories, but we don't have documentation for it, which means this is the first person that we know for sure lived in the house. So we usually call him the first owner, but probably not the builder. And this is the brother of Peter Ory, so the person that the county is named after. He did fight in the Revolution, so left the plantation to his wife Harriet, was fighting with Moultrie down near Charleston. When the British took Charleston in 1780, he was captured, and he agreed to give up the fight, give up arms, not fight against Britain anymore. A lot of the people who were captured end up doing that. He sent his kids off to England where they would be safe, and then just a year after that, we take Georgetown, and it looks like the Americans are going to win after all. So after the war, he was immersed, which just means that he was taxed pretty heavily for switching sides near the end, but we don't talk about that part so much. So first owner of the house, we do talk a lot about his wife, Harriet, and Harriet is the daughter of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, so that is our Pinckney connection, which means we already have Ory and Pinckney, which are two big South Carolina names. So Harriet Pinckney Ory marries Daniel, and for a lot of the years that she lived at Hampton, she was running the place. So during the Revolution, while Daniel is gone, she runs the plantation. There's a family story where she meets Francis Marion during that time and gives him some supplies. He escapes the British. It's a great story. We're not entirely sure if that's a true story, but a very good story. And she's running the plantation during the Revolution. Her son inherits the house when his father dies, but he never came back from England. He went to school during the Revolution in England. He stays there. He doesn't come back, which means that even though he has inherited the house, he's not there to run it, so his mother is still running the property, which isn't a bad thing because she has a lot of experience at that point. Plus, with her mother, Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who also had experience running plantations, they've got it pretty well handled. But he never comes back to America. He briefly visits twice that we know of, but he marries a French woman and he lives in France. He really, really likes France. He is also related to the Ories, so he has the connection there. But since he doesn't come back, he dies in France, which means that his mother actually inherits the house for 2 years after her son died. And then 2 years later, when she died, that means the house goes to the daughter instead of the son. So far right over here, Harriet Pinckney Ory Rutledge, which is a very long name. I usually call her Harriet Jr. But the person down here is her father-in-law, and this is where the Rutledge name comes in, another big South Carolina name. So John Rutledge here is the first governor of the state, rather than the colony. So the state of South Carolina, he's the first governor. And he also signed the Constitution. He works with the Supreme Court for a little while. I think he's the second head of the Supreme Court. And he has a brother who signs the Declaration. If you watch the 1776 musical, the guy singing about Molasses Tyrone, that is her uncle-in-law. So it's another big politically involved family. And Harriet marries his son Frederick. I didn't put in Frederick's picture because I couldn't find one. But Harriet, when she marries Frederick Rutledge, brings in that Rutledge last name, and then she has 8 children, which is a big change from her mother, who only had 2. But with those 8 children, a son inherits, then a grandson inherits, then a great-grandson inherits. So that's 5 generations, and I would get more into this, but don't want to go all day. So this is just the basics, the first owners of Hampton. I do also want to talk about other people who are living there. So again, with the amount of labor that's required for rice and indigo, we do have record of hundreds of other people who lived at Hampton. We don't always have their names, but this is what we do have. And this is a chart that we actually have inside of the house. where you can see the names, everyone that we have record of who was ever a slave at Hampton. It's not comprehensive. So for example, 1758 right here, there are 5 names listed, and there were definitely more than 5 people who were slaves there in 1758. What this is coming from is, I believe, a will from a family friend where they left those 5 people to somebody in the Rutledge family, or the Ori family at that point. So it's just what we've been able to find. Some lists are more comprehensive than others. So for example, 1786, that's everyone through here. So that's about 300 people. And at the height of rice production, there would have been between 300 to 400 people who were enslaved in Hampton. So that's a very large number, and we're very lucky to have this document, which is actually from an inventory when the first owner, Daniel Ori, died. Since it's from an inventory, a lot of the names have a number after them, which is what they're valued at in British pounds for an inventory. So one of the numbers that I bring up a lot on the tour is when Daniel Ori died, they inventoried all of his property for tax and inheritance reasons. So we have the value of 300 people at over 15,000 pounds total, and then the value of all of the furniture in this mansion house at 800 pounds. So today's money, that's something like $100,000 for the furniture in the house, and then $3 million for people. So a lot of the wealth that these plantation families have, it's in people. And we try and get what information we can from these lists. With the Ori Pinckney Rutledges, we have a lot of their documents, so letters and wills, things like that, letters. But we can get a lot of information from that, not so much for the other people living here, because for a long period it was illegal for them to learn how to read or write. So the information that we can find, we have to find from other sources. So sometimes it's just from these numbers where we try and guess how old they were, what they may have done that would have affected a value. But what I have circled here is a family group, Old Sogo, Young Sogo, and Joe. And I think Kate right here is also part of that group. So Old Sogo and Kate had several children, but Young Sogo and Joe are 2 that we know of. And they are listed again, one person, Sogo, over here in one of the later years. We're not sure which Sogo that is, older or younger, but we found a runaway advertisement where the younger Sogo and Joe had attempted to free themselves, had attempted to run away. We don't know what happened to them. But this is Daniel Ori down here. They talk about Joe and Sogo at 22 and 25 years old, which is younger than me, and attempted to run. They went south towards Charleston, but we don't have any record of what happened to them, if they succeeded or not. So we try and guess things about all the people who are living at Hampton just from the documentation that we have. And we try and talk about that on the tour as well.
And what year was that?
I think 17... It's not on there, but I want to say it's in the 1760s. I'll have to check and make sure, actually. And then the last person that I do want to talk about is Archibald Rutledge, who is a very, very prolific writer. I'm sure a lot of people have read some of his work. And I put in some pictures. These are pictures that I took. So if you would like to tell me how good they are, I would appreciate it. Thank you. So the pictures, there's one on the left from one of the ponds out in the woods with the cypress trees. Of course, we have our live oaks with the resurrection ferns, Spanish moss, and pine trees. The one on the right in the corner, that is my favorite tree on the whole park, just because I think it looks like it's reaching out. So I take a ton of pictures of that tree. A lot of flowers, azaleas, Adamasco lilies. It's not a great picture of the camellias, but I was trying to get a sense of how tall that camellia was. This is some kind of viburnum. I went and downloaded an app to my phone to try and identify a lot of these because there's so many types of flowers out there. And with all of that beauty, all the nature around the site, that could inspire someone to write a lot of poetry. And of course there's Archibald Rutledge in this picture. He is even writing something. He is the last owner of Hampton, and he's South Carolina's first poet laureate, and very, very prolific writer. So there's something like over 300 books and articles, collections of poetry that he published. And he grew up in McClellanville at Hampton. In the late 1800s, he left and went to Pennsylvania and was a teacher there for about 30 years, but when he retired, he came back to Hampton and started to fix up the house. While he lived in Pennsylvania, he was named South Carolina's first poet laureate. The position is created for him. And put one of his poems in there. It sounds silly if I read it out loud, so I'll just give you a minute. You can see why he's the first poet laureate. I actually like his prose a little bit better than his poetry, but he publishes a ton of poetry. Another picture of him. And two of the book covers that I put on here, one is Home by the River, which is his most popular, at least from what we have at Hampton. And it's a lot about the house. You can see the picture is that front portico of Hampton. And a lot of the family history that we have comes from Archibald, just because he wrote so much about the area and the community and his family. So a lot of that is in Home by the River. But the book on the right is a book of his books. So all of those images on the cover are covers of books that he published. So it's an entire book on things that he published, which is how you can tell that he wrote a lot. It needs a reference book. But one of the other things that he did was when he came back to the house, besides publishing, he also started to give tours, which is another thing that we talk about a lot. So going back to the 1930s, 1940s, Hampton has been open to the public to come and see. And I do have people who come through on the tour with me and say, I did a tour with Archibald back in the 60s, which is very hard to live up to. And if anyone is a Pat Conroy fan, he also did that. He came through and met Archibald Rutledge in the 60s and talked about that in one of his books. But the photo up here is how Archibald had the ballroom set up. He had it kind of like a museum because as he was renovating the house, he kept finding interesting old things. So he set up a museum, he sold some of his books, and he gave tours. Sometimes to people which is mostly what happens with us, just who were wandering through on their way to Myrtle Beach or on their way to Charleston and happened to see the sign. But a lot of people who read his work and were fans came and took the tour and visited with him. So to continue with that, we know he was giving tours up until he left in the 1960s. He moved out in 1969 and sold the house to the state in 1971. And a big reason for that was so it would stay open to the public. So photo from the 70s where the site was dedicated. And this picture is from the National Park Service, and this is another collection of photos that you can find online through their website. But what our parks person is doing up here, we inventoried all the changes that Archibald made to the house. So when he moved back in, he did put in one bathroom. He didn't want to put in electric, but later on that gets added in. And the room that he's in right now, it's set up like a kitchen. The original kitchen would have been outside. So based on the inventory that we have, we know that room was originally a study, not a kitchen. So we came through and we photographed everything, and then we took his additions back out, just to bring the house back to the original state. And you can kind of see what we did in this picture. This is in the dining room, which Archibald made into his bedroom. So we keep track of what the rooms were used for over the years. But what we've done is taken out part of the plasterwork. So here's our finished wall. We leave part of the plaster exposed. So for a lot of people who don't have any building experience, they don't really know how these buildings are put together. So you can see the plaster where it's attached to these small strips of wood called lath, and then just the bare beams of the house, which is the oldest part of the house. And that way you can see a lot more about the architecture, how this was built. So that's one of the things that we really focus on with the house tour. And we also try and do a lot of archaeology. The state archaeologists really like coming out to Hampton because every time they find something that they were not aware was there, We had an electrical line issue a couple months ago where we had to dig up one of the lines, and we ran into a brick foundation that we had no idea was there, which happens a lot at Hampton. So this photo is from a couple of years ago. These are our state archaeologists down here. And this is where they're digging up the foundation, where we believe the slave settlement used to be. And some of the things that they found out there were thimbles and beads, so sewing equipment. We think maybe there was a seamstress or a tailor who lived in this building. And even though the building isn't standing anymore, what we've done is we dug the foundation back up, we built it up a little bit so you can see where it was, and we put up a wayside. So this is a sketch of what we believe the building looked like. If you come out to the park, there is a glass see-through etching of this picture, so you can look through it and line up the picture with the foundation in the landscape and get an idea of what it looked like when it was still standing. There's also an archaeology dig coming up in the fall, if anyone wants to come out and get their hands dirty. It's a really fun thing to do, so we're trying to pull in a lot of documents that we have, things that Archibald wrote, and the archaeology to tell the story of the site. And very briefly, I do want to talk about what we have coming up. This is all on our Friends Group website, but just to summarize, October, we'll be out here again talking a little bit about the legends and lore of Hampton and the Santee area, and October is the only time of year that we do our more ghost-themed tours. So the last 3 Fridays and Saturdays of October, our 10, 12, and 2 tours will have some of those ghost stories. In November, we have a park cleanup day, and we'll be out here again to talk more in depth about Archibald Rutledge. And we have a combination day on the 16th where we'll have Barbara McCormick out, who's a McClellanville artist who does sweetgrass baskets, and another Indigo demonstration. And then December, there's 2 Friday and Saturdays where we do our holiday tours. And we're open every day except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. In the fall, it'll be from 9 to 5, and we usually do tours at 10, 12, and 2. And if anyone's interested in coming out, falls in love with the site like I did, we always need help with gardening, maintenance. If anyone really likes history, which I'm assuming everyone does since you're all here listening to me, we can always use help giving tours through the house. And then if anyone's interested in just coming out to the Friends Group meeting, we do have one in November. But this is all on our website. If you have any questions, I'll be sticking around for a little bit. But I did want to give a chance, if anyone has specific questions about what I talked about, we can discuss those.
Did Hampton have a rice mill on site?
Not that we're aware of. From what we can tell, they had a lot of people who were involved with pounding the rice with a mortar. We know that they had the winnowing house out on the island where all the rice fields were. So they were definitely processing rice out there, but they didn't have anything like a Lucas mill.
Thank you.
This isn't a question, it's just, I'm struck, almost dumb, by the 1 year, didn't you say there were like 300 enslaved Africans on the plantation?
Mm-hmm.
And there were how many white owners and overseers? How many men? Maybe 6? And the
Something
fact
like
that
that.
6 people could keep 300 souls enslaved, I can't even wrap my mind around that, how they had no hope, no,
Let's see if I can go.
you know, how can that be? That you can oppress people to that extent, like just to be able to have 6 people control 300.
The numbers are scary to look at. There's a couple of people, go all the way back here. There's a couple of people on this list where they're listed as drivers. So there's a Daniel here and an Angus here, listed at 500 pounds and 650 pounds. So there was kind of a hierarchy that helped keep that population under control, where you have people who are working in the fields, but then also fellow slaves who are in a position of authority over them, who are maybe being given extra clothing, extra rations, special privileges, to work as the kind of in-between step between the field hands and then the overseers over them. So driver in this case means a slave driver. So they had a hierarchy there to help keep that There were, of course, just this kind of general atmosphere of terror almost. Well, there were a lot of stories of people who did run away and were captured. And a lot of the times the punishment for that would be being separated from their family. They would never see them again.
I guess a follow-up, how does the Historic Society interpret the lives of enslaved people?
That's a great question. We're trying to do it more and more. So this chart is one of our big ones where we're trying to keep those names where people can see them. We try and do more research into individuals, but like I said, it's hard to do without a lot of documentation. So a lot of what we do is try and make guesses about their lives based on the numbers, based on the family groups that we can keep track of. There are some stories that we have. A lot of people at the end, so 1860s, that list is short, but we still know there were about 130 people who were enslaved there. And then after the war, a lot of those people end up staying on as tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and the families still live in the area. So we're very lucky to be able to get some oral histories from community members who are still nearby. So we have a lot of the family history with the Rutledges, but then some of the other families who are nearby, what little documentation that we have, and then trying to keep it going with the archaeology, trying to find out more about the slave settlement site.
So are you publishing any of the family stories, the oral tradition that comes down? What's being done with that?
Mostly it's just being used for our interpretation. We have some of the quotes up in our building where we talk about them during the tour, but I'm not aware if they're published anywhere. Look into that. Yeah.
When you put the rice field trunk back, did you re-impound that field, and did you therefore have trouble with the Corps of Engineers?
There were a lot of people who were involved. Luckily, most of it was still there. Over the years, we have built it up again just to prevent. We knew there was a rice field there, and to try and keep it there where we could talk about it, we had kept putting dirt onto the embankment so it wouldn't wash out when any hurricanes came through. So then when putting the trunk back in, it was just a matter of opening the embankment back up and putting it back where we knew it already was. So we were really lucky actually to still have the foundations of the rice field there where we didn't have to do too much work with it. Mostly just putting the trunk in.
You talked several times about things like this list that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you keep all your records? Is there a climate control place that you have them?
Not at the park. All the records that we have, a lot of it is things that we get from other collections. So with the Charleston Museum or from USC, what we do have is kept in climate control in the central office in Columbia. So not at the site where the power goes out if a hurricane comes through. That would be a big disaster.
And the artifacts that Rutledge had found that were in his museum, where have they ended up?
A couple different places. There are some that are still with family members. There's a lot of things that he sold off as he was leaving the house, but some of the things that we do have, again, some of it's in storage in Columbia, but we have a couple of things on display. So there's part of a set of wedgwood that we have that we think was used when George Washington visited the house. It's spread all over.
Hannah, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.